You are listening to Exploring Clean Energy, where we uncover the ideas, innovations, and projects powering our sustainable future. I'm Andy Marsland. Welcome to the show. So I'm thrilled to welcome our guest today, the CEO of InterContinental Energy, Alex Tancock. Very warm welcome, Alex.
No, it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me, Andy.
Yeah, and thanks for being on the Exploring Clean Energy podcast. So first of all, I mean, you've been involved in hydrogen for an awfully long time, longer than a lot of people out there. So as I understand it, InterContinental commenced in 2014, and then we went through that kind of, well, I was going to say slow period, but an increasing focus towards the year of 2020 to 2024. We saw that huge excitement and that hype, and now here we are today when it seems like a lot of that hype has kind of subsided and there's only a number of projects remaining. So what did you first see in 2014 that perhaps others didn't?
So we didn't set out to be a hydrogen company in that sense. In 2014, I'd already been doing renewables for 15 years by then, including developing the world's biggest wind farm at the time, which was in Australia, in South Australia in the mid-north, big projects in China. And my vision was, and the vision of my co-founders was, that if you projected into the future a world where wind and solar were the cheapest sources of energy on the planet, and we needed clean energy, ideally because of climate change and sustainability issues, then if you took inspiration from the oil and gas sector and you went for incredible scale with incredible resource, you could end up developing these huge energy fields, energy hubs, as we called them, which would be able to provide cheap, clean energy to customers, be it customers that wanted electrons, customers that wanted molecules. And now we have a new set of customers who are asking for data. So we didn't set out to do hydrogen per se. We set out to develop the world's largest, lowest cost clean energy hubs. So we looked at the whole world. We looked at Middle East, we looked at North Africa, we looked at the Americas, we looked at Asia, and we concluded that Australia had particular attractive qualities. And I guess two in particular is the scale that you can build at in Australia, the resource you get in Australia, and then layered on top of that is the jurisdiction itself. And I think what we're learning from what's happened in the Middle East is that the reliability of the jurisdiction really does matter. So Australia had these sort of, two qualities in terms of the sites themselves and this one quality in terms of the country itself.
Yeah, and I wanted to ask you, maybe we can move on to that later on in the conversation about what's been happening on the global stage and how that has sort of, impacted or brought to the fore some of the projects that you've been doing. So, yeah, InterContinental has always spoken about that kind of mega scale. Was there a particular moment in time that you realized that it had to be at scale to become nation shaping?
I think when you've been involved in energy projects or resource projects, and I think Australia is such a great example of resource projects and scale. If one looks at the Pilbara and the Northwest Shelf, whether it's the LNG exports or the iron ore exports, scale has a quality unto its own because you can reduce the cost of your product and you can produce volumes that your customers need. So we took the exact same approach when we thought about clean energy. If scale has won in every resource sector globally, why would it be any different in energy? And we've seen through our 10 years of development now and the development of our P2H2 node that scale really does matter and will matter. So, again, you think about we're trying to solve climate change and energy. Small projects just can't get you there because they're small. So that's the first problem they've got. But the second issue you've got is that with bespoke projects, you never get standardization. And one of the things that the resource sector has benefited from is standardization and manufacturing standardization. So if you can bring that mentality, if you think of car manufacturing, you think of any of these large scale manufacturing sectors, they drive down price. So we have to move from this bespoke, artisanal way of thinking about renewable energy projects and move to scale standardization in the right jurisdictions. So that was a vision we had 10 years ago. I think that vision holds today. And if anything, it's been validated and vindicated today. So when you talk about lots of projects, that were, join sort of the hydrogen hype cycle, if you will, a lot of those were small, a lot of them were bespoke. And, frankly, they were never going to be there and survive long term anyway. So, the way to think about our portfolio in Australia, it's not actually two projects. We have 47 projects just in two locations, with the P2H2 node being the, say, Lego building block equivalent, right? So again, do you build one mega project or do you split a mega project into small digestible chunks where you de-risk the design with a standard design as I say, like a Lego block, and then you just kill block, 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 block. That's the way to build big projects. And again, the industries in the resource sector have been doing this for decades. All we did was apply those lessons to this sector.
Yes. Yep. And maybe for the listeners, we can break that down in terms of the two mega projects. And then in researching for this episode, I was excited to learn about the P2H2 node technology that you guys have got. And what it seems like that you touched upon there is that middle road allowing that mega scale, but to have the kind of, if I can put it like this, like the cookie cutter, the duplication. So it's not, as you say, bespoke engineering every time to create those economies of scale. Before we get into that then, so we touched upon before the state of the hydrogen industry at the moment. So more broadly, does it come down to that economies of scale and the cost that, what separates the projects that are going to get built from those that won't? And it seems like from hundreds and another announcement week on week that we were seeing in sort of, 2020, 2021 to only, a handful or more large scale projects happening now in Australia. So what do you think kind of separates those projects out?
So when you look at essentially what the customers want, and I think you work yourself back from there. Customers want, reliable product. They want the lowest cost product and the highest quality product. So, projects need to be near customers or talking to customers and making sure that they're providing the customers what they want. And I think, many of the projects that aren't continuing at the moment are projects that started development without the customer mindset.
Yes.
And so, that they had their little pathway forward. It just turned that customers weren't interested in that location or in that product or at that price point. But I think it's also quite normal. And I don't think this is a bug. I think this is a feature. And I think it's a positive feature overall, is that when you get a new sector emerging, which green hydrogen still is, you get an explosion of people with ideas. And some will turn out to be right and some will turn out to be wrong. And it's because of that explosion of ideas that the industry learns which ones really make sense. So in a way, I don't think, this is a criticism of what happened. It had to happen this way for the right answers to come out the other end. So I've been in renewables for almost 30 years. And if I think back to the history of wind and solar, the first utility scale projects were built in the early 80s. And then essentially renewables spent 15 years as a niche with very many different types of experiments in how to do wind and solar projects. We had single-bladed wind turbines, two-bladed wind turbines, three-bladed wind turbines, four-bladed wind turbines. We had turbines that were, horizontal axis, vertical axis. With solar, we had all these different varieties of, thin film, polysilicon. You had all these explosion of different ideas. And yet, when you look at the sectors now, they're very, common in terms of how, three-bladed wind turbines, et cetera, et cetera. So this period is completely normal. And it's in a way that evolution that we had to go through as a sector to emerge as what we are today, which is, let's say, maybe less hype and more projects being executed. Again, people have a tendency to say, oh, green hydrogen, it's not going anywhere. There was a very good piece of data put out recently. It was BNEF, I think, or McKinsey, where they compared the first 6 or 7 years of green hydrogen versus wind and solar. And we're growing at 5 times what wind and solar did in the 1980s when they launched. So I think there's this perception which is incorrect, that either the industry's not going anywhere or the industry's failed because the hype bubble popped. But we all know that hype bubbles are very normal. I mean, we're living through an AI hype bubble as we speak, right? Most of us can probably remember the internet hype bubble. So they happen. But, Amazon went up, it crashed, and now it's one of the biggest and most impressive, companies on the planet. So I think this is normal, what we're going through.
Yeah, and all part of that iterative process. And you've been quite vocal in the media about Australia's opportunity and, the future made in Australia and the green iron. So what would it take for the Pilbara to become a major green iron manufacturing hub?
Look, I think all the ingredients are there. If you look at the amount of exports of iron ore, that's clearly there. You look at the resource available from a renewable energy perspective, it's there in different parts of the Pilbara. So in large part, all the ingredients really are there. What it needs now is focused effort from companies like ourselves and our partners there and our customers there. And then you need the government to do a little bit of a support and enabling works. So again, if you look at the Northwest Shelf or the iron ore industry itself, they all received some level of government support in the early days to get them going. Be it, a port. Now you have, you've got Port Hedland, you've got Karratha, so that's all there. Be it some construction works, be it a little bit of assistance here and there. So I think all the ingredients really are there. And the government, whether it's the West Australian state government or the federal government, it does seem to us that they want this to happen. And over time, because of that, I think we can quite confidently see that this will happen. Just to give you some sort of statistics and some example of the scale of the opportunity. So if you take the Australian Renewable Energy Hub, AREH, and you look at our potential full build out of 26 gigawatts of upstream renewables. So that's sort of half wind, half solar. Think of it that way. That would decarbonize around 4% of the iron ore exports of Pilbara. 4%, right?
Wow.
So a project of the size of AREH at 26 gigawatts is only 4% of that market for export of green iron. So, the opportunity is absolutely huge. And what it does also show you is the scale of emissions that come out of iron as a sector. It is 8% of global emissions are coming out of the steel sector. And one of the other interesting dynamics is, one has to think about the political overlay when one thinks about anything like this. And if you think of, the Koreans, the Japanese, the Chinese, they have a lot of jobs in that sector. And obviously the politics won't allow them to lose all their jobs. But at the same time, they do want to decarbonize. I mean, China now has very clear policies in place, and the Koreans and the Japanese, we expect to have similar policies in place soon. So how do you, from a political point of view, not risk all of those jobs, but decarbonize? Now, one option is to import all of that energy to your home country. But, shipping hydrogen is expensive. So you do hit the economics. The alternative is you take the very energy intensive part of making steel, which is when you reduce your iron ore to get the iron, and you just do that in Australia. So you're exporting most of the energy consumption and emissions to the Pilbara, where you can do it with clean energy, but you keep most of the jobs and value add locally, so you don't have a political uprising. So with iron ore in particular and green iron in particular, there's a really good match between if you localize HBI production in the Pilbara, which is an intermediary step where you're exporting these hot briquetted irons, which is, almost pure iron. You can do that in Australia really cost effectively, but they keep lots of the high tech jobs, locally. So you don't get this issue with people losing jobs. So that's an industry where you can really see a sort of a matching between Australia and its strategic customers in Korea, China, Japan, Taiwan, elsewhere. So that's just one very good example of what we can do with green hydrogen.
Yeah, fascinating. And let's dig in a little bit more to the Australian Renewable Energy Hub. So that's your flagship project at the moment, AREH, as it's known, as you mentioned there, 26 gigawatt. So yeah, where is it strategically located, and at what stage are you at with the project now?
So AREH, I'll apologize for the name, the terrible name. We should have come up with a better name. That's right. So, it is the second largest permitted power project on the planet after the Three Gorges Dam. It's got federal and state environmental approvals already. It has been under development for some 8 years already. We've got partnerships with the state government through Horizon Power on part of the transmission line for that project. Because, when you look at the scale of that sort of project, you can't build it right next to Port Hedland. There's too many existing users of all that land. So it was as close as we could get to Port Hedland, where there was still available land. You're talking about a project that has wind speeds at night that are over 10 meters per second. So, that is kind of the best wind speeds you get in Tasmania type equivalents for people to think of it that way, or offshore European wind, but they go through the night mainly. During the day, the wind speed drops. And then during the day, we have the Pilbara sun. So what that does is it allows you to run over 72% capacity factor with no storage whatsoever. So if you think of a typical solar project is probably running between 20 and 35% capacity factor. A typical wind project in Australia is somewhere in the low 30s, mid 30s. We're running at 72. So it's an incredible site. So what that does, it allows you to run all of your midstream, downstream equipment much more efficiently without any penalties on storage. This project doesn't get connected to the national grid in that sense. It's more remote. But again, that was a feature. So one of the bets we made was that in the future, the demands on the power network would be too high. And so building projects of the scale that we wanted to do would be politically implausible. Now, we didn't know data centers were going to go crazy. We assumed electric vehicles would be there one day. But what we assumed was that voters would be unhappy for the cheapest energy on the network to be going to a big industrial user instead of them. And so because deserts don't vote, we decided to make sure that our projects around the world would be in locations where there were no voters, so that the political layer wouldn't then, tank the business. And I think that was quite prescient because when you look around the world now, whether it's, data centers or otherwise, there's a huge backlash against massive energy consumers getting the cheapest power. So again, on that one, I'll give us a tick in terms of having positioned ourselves correctly for the future. So AREH, so fully permitted in partnership with Horizon Power. We've also got other partnerships with customers that we can't disclose just now. The team's done a tremendous job with all of the engineering work, the design work, the pre-feed work. As I say, it's permitted already. We've been working with the traditional owners at the project for some 9 years now. We have an ILUA, an Indigenous Land Use Agreement. These are actually quite difficult to get in general, and very few actually get signed. And what that shows you is that our ability to work with the traditional owners is genuine. And, we really are trying to do the best by them. We can always talk about WGEH later, which was quite a revolutionary agreement we did with the traditional owners there. So we're on track for our first FID in around 2 years' time. We still think that's on track. And then
Exciting.
we have a project in Budari. So in the strategic industrial area in Port Hedland, we have a piece of land where we will be doing our phase 1 hydrogen production for customers that are going to be hopefully building in Budari. So again, we're AREH is an integral part of sort of the next wave of industrial projects and economic development in the Pilbara.
And on that project, what are the biggest engineering challenges that are still ahead of you?
So that project is not so much the engineering challenge from a technical point of view. It's more of an execution risk, let's call it. You're taking upstream, midstream, and downstream, and you're trying to make sure that, they all build at the right pace and all work together well. So, so that's the bigger challenge for us. We're not having to deploy, let's say, brand new technology. Even our P2H2 node, if I take a second just to sort of talk about what that is, because we're very proud of that work.
Yeah, it's a good segue. So, in research, it seems like fantastic technology that you have kind of uncovered or designed that you've patented. So I'll let you take it from there. But yeah, this was one of the key areas that I was fascinated to learn more about.
Yeah, look, so when our engineering and innovation team was looking at how to execute these big projects, we took a slightly different pathway to what ended up being done in NEOM in Saudi Arabia. And effectively, the team asked itself, how do you build a mega project in chunks? And how do you strip out as much of the expensive capital cost as you can and enhance the efficiency? And what they concluded was what you needed to do was come up with a standardized, let's call it middle bit, where you put all of your electrolysis. So imagine you've got this donut. On the inside of the middle donut, which is usually empty, is where your node is. The donut where you've got, the bit that you would eat, the dough, that's where all your solar is. And outside of that is where all your wind is. And what that allows you to do is to strip out a lot of the extensive transmission network because everything is quite close. And then in the middle, where all this power is coming into, you have a very concentrated ability to turn that into the hydrogen. And then when that turns into the hydrogen, your hydrogen acts as a battery because you have to export the hydrogen to your customer in a pipeline. And in the pipeline, you can change the pressure and it basically acts as a battery. So we don't have to build so much expensive storage. We don't have to build so much high cost electrical transmission network, and we increase the efficiencies and reduce the losses. So that was the key insight that the engineering team made. And it sounds obvious now, like all clever ideas. When you hear it, you go, well, of course, that's what you would do. But when the team in Perth started doing this, they were the outliers. And most of the rest of the industry just said, oh, we'll just build power lines everywhere. It doesn't matter. And it turns out it absolutely does matter. So the team in Australia was the one who came up with that idea, has developed it since. That idea has now received support from ARENA, the government agency in Australia, the Australian Renewable Energy Agency. So to support with the next level of development for the digital twin and optimizing that. And we've got quite a few clients now talking to us and partners talking to us about working with us on that. We've recently signed an agreement with Samsung to work together on the design of the node from an EPC perspective. And we have lots of partnerships with equipment companies too. So this P2H2 node, it's now patented in 50 countries, more than 50 countries, including the US, Canada, Australia, and many others. And it's a really novel systems architecture. And it's one that we're talking to other developers about. So, what we've told other developers is, it's quite expensive and time consuming to do all this work. We've already done it. So again, if you think of your laptop, which has your little Intel inside sticker, our P2H2 node will be the equivalent for green hydrogen projects at scale. So anyone doing a multi-gigawatt green hydrogen project will need to use the P2H2 node because there's no other way to build it efficiently. And that's already been tested. We've seen that happen in Saudi Arabia where they decided to do it without a node and the results were not spectacular.
And I was reading somewhere that it's about a 10 to 20% differential, is it, in terms of efficiencies between using a node and not using a node? Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. But when you're in a commodity product, that's the difference between viable and unviable. So yeah, but it's not an insubstantial amount of capex saving, 10 to 20%.
Yeah, huge, huge. And your other major project, so the Western Green Energy Project, another acronym,
Yeah,
WGEH.
we're terrible at naming things.
That's the world's largest green fuel project. And I was just reading this again, 70 gigawatts. Most people will find it difficult to even conceptualize something of that size. So how can you kind of explain or articulate the magnitude of that project?
The way to think about it is not as a 70 gigawatt project. It's to think about it as 35 nodes. And when you think about it as 35 nodes, as I said before, with each one being just a repeatable cookie cutter Lego block approach, you can almost make projects that are infinitely large if you want, because all you're doing is adding one block and then another block and then another block. So all you're doing is extending the timeline that it takes to build out the project, or you can build them in parallel as it were. So again, we took the approach, the same one that resource companies always take. And I'd like to think about it this way. If you were to look up today on the internet, what are the 10 biggest oil fields in history, right? You'll find the first one is called Ghawar, it's in Saudi Arabia, right? The second one is Burgan in Kuwait. Then you'll find other ones up there, the Russian one, you'll find Cantarell in Mexico, etc. These were country-making resources because the scale of the resource was such that they could produce and create so much national wealth that they could then basically support economies and to do other things. I would like to think that when we look back in 2050 and we Google what are the biggest green energy hubs on the planet, Australia will have a couple of them, and WGH could well be the biggest. And what these big resources allow you to do is to indigenize your supply chain. They allow you the volume and the security that you need in demand for the suppliers, that they can start doing things locally. One of the issues with small projects is you never create the volumes needed to create the local industry to support them. And what we wanted to do with our projects is go for that scale because it allows you to compete globally, because it drives down the cost, but it also allows you to start making things in Australia. So the Future Made in Australia Act that the government put out recently, that's exactly the mindset we brought to what we did 10 years ago. Because as Australians, you want to see that those jobs are going to be made locally and that technology is going to be developed locally. We've done it with the P2H2 node. We've used an Australian team to do all that work. And we're now trying to bring that mindset to our projects. Now, that's not to say we won't, have to import equipment from places like China. We absolutely will in the early stages, because to add all the complexity of building an industry on top of a project is too much. But over time, that scale allows you to start localizing what you do. The other thing is when you look at the enabling costs of a big project, if you've got to build a pier and you've got to build a road and you have to build some housing for your staff. Now, if you're doing a 10 megawatt project, you're spreading all of that cost over 10 megawatts. If you're building a 1,000 megawatt project, you're spreading that cost over 1,000 megawatts. So there are huge advantages to scale. But once you've paid for all of that, what you don't want to do is pay for it again, right? So imagine a scenario where I do 35 projects across Australia. I have 35 teams doing 35 pieces of work, 35 independent designs. You can just imagine the nightmare. Or I can do it in one place. And I have one team doing, one node at a time. That's just repeated and repeated and repeated and repeated. That's how you drive down cost. That's how you make Australia the most competitive producer on the planet. It's because we can do projects that have multiple phases. And that's the secret sauce that Australia has. And any developer trying to large scale green hydrogen projects that's not doing multi-phase will ultimately not survive. And ultimately you don't change the planet that way. And ultimately you don't create an industry that way.
No, and having that ability for the first phase or the first node to then fund the ongoing nodes as you move forward as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And you think of the banks, you think of everything. If the banks have given the project finance to node 1, how easy is it to give project finance to node 2? I mean, it's literally next door. You know everything about the project and it's completely de-risked. You do a new project somewhere different, they have to get familiar with that project. They have to de-risk that project. So on every level, multi-phasing nodes is the only pathway to scale. Now, the first node is always difficult, right? I mean, it's a big project. It's challenging. And that's the work we're going through right now. And again, think of the subsidies. If 35 projects were launched across Australia, they would require 35 subsidies from the government to get off the ground. Whereas if you launch one project with 35 phases, it's just phase 1 that needs a bit of help. The other 34 take care of themselves. So even from an Australian society perspective, multi-phase projects lower the cost to everybody. And then they raise the economic impact of what we do for everybody. It's the only logical pathway forward.
Yeah, fantastic. And it sounds like you've been getting significant interest from Japan and Korea. So, at what stage are those discussions at, and how important or how critical is that for the project to progress?
So our partnerships with our overseas customers are very important. Now, many of the Japanese and Korean companies were talking to large investors in Australia already. So it's a jurisdiction that they're very familiar with and that they've already invested a lot of money in. And so for us, it is incredibly important that we continue working with, customers that are Australian, but also big investors in Australia that are foreign. Because when you look at our energy hubs, and again, if I take the AREH as an example, we have offtake agreements with at various levels with power customers, with hydrogen customers. We have conversations with customers that want green ammonia, and we have conversations with customers that want data. So, we're looking at domestic consumption, but we're also looking at exports. So, talking with customers that are either overseas buyers or investors within Australia is critical to what we do. And that's why, in a way, we called our projects hubs, because we saw them as pathways to multiple different customers. And this is, again, if I take an analogy that's happening right now in Australia, there's over 7 gigawatts of data centers waiting to connect to the grid around the Sydney area, the greater Sydney area. Now, we all know that 7 gigawatts of data centers will not connect into the grid around the greater Sydney area. It's impossible.
Hmm.
And so there's this mismatch between the number of people who want power and where the power is available, and the impact of that price, as I said previously, on voters and people that need to buy the power. And so there's now a discussion that's been launched. If you sort of look at the discussion within the data center community on the East Coast, then maybe what we should be doing is building renewable energy clusters where you've got renewable energy at scale and you bring the industry to that renewable energy rather than trying to force the renewable energy to move to the customer. But that's exactly what we started to do 10 years ago with AREH. We foresaw this idea of an industrial cluster that would have multiple users all wanting slightly different products. And the base input is the cheap and green power. And then from there, you decide who you sell it to. So it's interesting to see that, having spent 10 years going down a pathway, suddenly on the East Coast, people are saying, hey, maybe we should be doing projects that are basically exactly what we're doing. The difference is you need to be near the coast and near the ports to do these projects from a logistical point of view easily. And from a data point of view, what's really interesting is we've been approached recently by a large data center company who wants to see whether we can work with them on doing data for Asian customers, but using Australian data centers. And
Oh,
because
interesting.
the Pilbara is the closest point to Southeast Asia, the northwest of the coast of Australia is the closest point to Southeast Asia. And at AREH, we permitted 4 subsea cables as part of the original permit, precisely because we foresaw a day where we might want to export something into Asia. So not only is the project the second largest power station in history to be permitted, we actually have 4 cables that got permitted alongside it. So if customers want dedicated data cables to Singapore or to Manila or to Hanoi, Kuala Lumpur, Jakarta, we already have that permitted too. So that's one of the reasons that data center companies recently engaged with us to talk about that business model. So yeah, our hub concept is really coming alive.
Yes, yeah. And it's nice to hear you talk about that kind of optionality, I think, as well, which, I mean, the products that are kind of going to come off the back of those are obviously hydrogen. I believe you talk about ammonia and other kind of e-fuels as well. So the potential or the breadth that opens up of potential customers is interesting. And, particularly if you've got an offtake on the data center side as well, that's another avenue of revenue for you.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting how this is all developing. Now, again, I wouldn't say we foresaw some of it. We planned for the optionality. It's interesting to see that it's now sort of falling into place. And you mentioned data centers, and how that fits into the projects. And it's quite interesting. Our P2H2 node as our building block, turns out we've now begun the piece of work with the data center company. But if you integrate a relatively small, relative to the electrolysis data center, so let's say 200 megawatt data center, which is actually still big, you can actually supply it with 99.995% uptime, which is sort of the highest tier you get globally, for a power price of less than $50 a megawatt hour, which is, a quarter of what some people are paying in Asian markets. It's around half what many people are paying in other parts of Australia. And it would be 100% green, because we'd use the hydrogen as the backup top up when it's not got the renewable energy operating directly. So you end up with what could be, the world's cheapest, greenest data center infrastructure built into the node. So this nodal concept that the Australian team in Perth designed and came up with, it's interesting to see how it's evolving into something that can incorporate this data product as well. It's very exciting.
Yes, yeah. The discussions and the geopolitical focus of the last 6 months, if we can put it like that, there has been a lot more talk and a lot more focus on energy security. So perhaps could you talk to that and how that has kind of impacted, or has it changed anything for you over the last 6 months?
Yeah, it's changed a lot for us. Our driver when we set up ICE was not necessarily climate change per se. That's a side benefit of doing clean energy. But our key driver for setting up ICE was to create large sources of sovereign energy that was sustainable for the long term. Because obviously oil and gas, they deplete as soon as you start using them. So, what do you do in 10, 20, 30, 40 years when you've depleted your energy resource? So our vision was that, a country like Australia could produce sustainable energy for generations, and it would be clean, which is, a great benefit and helpful for climate change. And it's interesting to see how this sort of energy security discussion now, based on what's happened in the Gulf, I would say is in my view, at least at the moment, supersedes the climate change priority. So a conversation that we've been having recently with government and with others is sovereign fuels. And how do you take this hydrogen and use it for, say, mobility as one idea? Because obviously, hydrogen trucking, hydrogen cars, hydrogen trains, these are all possible. The technology exists today. There just has to be a will to use it. So the question of sovereign fuels is now one that we're being asked quite regularly in Australia. And it's certainly a space we believe we can play a very active and helpful role in. And so, yeah, so this crisis in the Middle East, I think it's opened everybody's eyes to the dependence that there was, and maybe the complacency that there was, that these fuels would always be there. We forget as well, I think as a society, that, we're relying on, for our primary, let's call it most important energy source, which is oil, a depleting asset, which we've spent the last 10 years under investing in globally. And if you look out 3, 4, 5, 6 years, I think one should be slightly worried about what the cost of oil is going to be based on supply and demand. So again, this is something we've been cognizant of since the very beginning. And, so again, we've always been thinking about what role do we play when the time comes. And that time has now come. And we
Yes.
are stepping up as a company with our partners to find how we can help create sovereign fuel solutions for the country.
Yeah. And looking to the future then, say 2035, what does success look like for you?
So in 2035, we will have phase 1 of AREH operating. We will have phase 2 of AREH either operating or near commissioning, and we will have phase 1 of WGEH operating and phase 2 under construction. So, our construction program will be non-stop from the day it starts, because we will roll out one node after the next. So we reach FID in the next 2 years, and then from there, it's just non-stop construction for forever, basically.
And is there one bottleneck that's holding you back at the moment? Anything that you want to get unplugged, as it were?
The challenge everybody has in our sector is offtake and customers. That was the problem with solar and wind in the early 80s. And it's the same challenge that we're working through at the moment. But having said that, we're feeling pretty good about AREH phase 1 and WGH phase 1 in terms of the partnerships that we have with customers, both domestic and overseas export customers. So, that's something we're moving forward with. And then, I think with government support, I'd love to say we don't need it, but that's not the case. In any early industry like ours, there's always going to be a need for some government support. And, on the state and federal level, these are active conversations we're having. They're trending in the right direction, but, it's going to require continued persistence on our part and on our customers' part too. So look, I'm optimistic. We've done 10 years of de-risking to get here. As you said, we were in this space long before the hype cycle, and we'll be in this space long after. This is as we say, it's a marathon, not a sprint. So, what we keep doing with our team, which is almost predominantly based in Australia, is driving our projects forward, working with our customers and working with government.
Yeah, great stuff. I prepared a few rapid fire questions, if you don't mind, Alex, to throw at you. So perhaps see how we go. If you could answer these in around a sentence or so. So what's the most underrated clean energy technology? Anything spring to mind?
I'll come back to that one.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah. Is there a big myth or misconception about hydrogen that you'd like to get out to the audience or clear up with the audience?
Biggest myth is that it can't work because the hype bubble popped a few years ago. hydrogen is tracking quicker than solar and wind did in its equivalent infancy, and there's no reason to think it won't continue accelerating.
Great. What's the most exciting market globally for hydrogen? Or is the one country that's getting energy policy right at the moment that's making it more attractive than others?
China, one word.
China. Okay, maybe we'll come back to that. What do you think from a labour perspective, what do you think is the most important skill for future energy leaders to have?
For future energy leaders, it's the ability to think across multiple disciplines, not just in one lane, but you have to think about the issues that are complex across different frames, whether it's engineering, business, local community. You can't be one dimensional.
Yes, yeah. And as we're going through the conversation, and yourself and your team should be, something that struck me was you should be very proud of the ability to challenge the status quo. I think when so many kind of went down the line of this is how it is, this is what we're doing it, and then you guys kind of flipped that on your head with the P2H2 node technology, just as one example. So yeah, that's one thing that struck out for me, for that curiousness to challenge and to look at potential other alternatives. That's fantastic. And in closing then, is there any overarching comments that you'd like to get out to the audience?
Before I answer that question, I'll answer your most underrated technology question.
Okay, love it. Yep.
The most underestimated technology in clean energy right now is the P2H2 node, because what it does is it opens up large-scale energy hubs across places like Australia, and the scale of what we could develop is so large that the impact would be tremendous. And that is currently underappreciated.
It certainly does sound like it's going to be a game changer for Australia, for the world, and wish you all the best. I'm excited to hear how you guys get on in the future. So maybe we could do a round 2 at some point.
Absolutely. No, it's been a pleasure speaking with you. Really interesting questions, really interesting conversation. And I apologize if I speak too much about things. But, at ICE, we're incredibly passionate about what we do. And we believe that what we're doing will have significant benefits to Australia and the world.
Thanks so much, Alex. Appreciate it. All the best.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for tuning into today's episode of Exploring Clean Energy. I hope you enjoyed the show. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. I'm keen to continue to bring you the best experts and most interesting projects. So if you have an exciting story to share, please feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn or email. I'm Andy Marsland, and hopefully see you next time.